Hello, and welcome to this edition of Secure Networks, the Endace Packet Forensic Files, with your host, Michael Morris. This episode's very special guest is Jean-Paul Bergeaux, Federal CTO for GuidePoint. Jean-Paul, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Thanks, Michael. As you said, I'm the Federal CTO for GuidePoint Security. I've been here, May will be 9 years. My role is really around doing architecture, cybersecurity, all-inclusive architecture for federal customers. So that's product, services, combinations to solve problems. And my background's a little bit varied. I started in the infrastructure side, working mostly in the storage and compute. Ended up doing some architecture around applications and helping the government stand up new things. One of my favorite things I think that I talk about I did this is I helped stand up the very first IRS electronic record system so that people could get answers before it was stood up. If you called the IRS, they would say, we'll call you back in a week or two when we find that file. And then after we got it stood up, they could answer questions right there. That was one of my crown. I love that because that's so impactful to people. But I've done a lot of different things like that over the years. And then about 15 years ago, I went from doing architecture and designs and helping stand up applications to moving into the cybersecurity space. It was around that time that cybersecurity was really moving into, we need to do more than be responsive and policy. We need to build architectures that are more holistic. And that was my specialty. So kind of got sucked into it, very happily sucked into it, and been doing cybersecurity for about 15 years.
No, your experience is great. I'm really looking forward to this conversation because your background really can shed some light on some of the challenges in the federal space and some of the things they're facing. So kind of where I want to start is let's start about some of the certification requirements. And can you explain the importance of certifications like FIPS 140-3 and NIAP for technology solutions being used by the federal government?
Sure. So the federal government, like anybody else, needs to make sure that what they're using is what they want and is doing the right things, and there's certain baselines. And so those two specific certifications you mentioned, both FIPS and NIAP, are based on NIST-oriented standards that then the federal government codified into their requirements for any products that they buy. So I'll start with the second one you mentioned. So NIAP is based on common criteria. Common criteria is a standard across the entire industry accepted as how do we figure out what's good and what has basic standards on development and deployment. And NIAP is basically the government's overarching acceptance of common criteria and enforcement of common criteria on things they purchase. It's no different than if you go to most industries, almost everybody has some sort of version of common criteria. Sometimes it's involved in an ISO or something along those lines. But that's really the government's like, hey, we need a baseline of understanding that this does what we need it to do the way it needs to be done. And then on the FIPS side, whenever you start talking about encryption obviously is super important, especially in secure networks. And for the government, they needed to know that encryption that was being used was used in a way that kept it protected. And that goes from either software versions of it or even hardware versions of it. So there's different levels of FIPS and how that encryption is deployed and how it meets certain standards. So the highest level standard, the one that really honestly comes most often, is a hardware version where they even get to the point of where you need to encase things in containers that cannot be accessed to make sure that encryption never can be touched or thwarted. So it's really important for the government. Both of those are important. And there's more other certifications, but those are two very key and common certifications for the government to know, hey, we know these standards are being met. We know what we're using is meeting those.
Yeah, no, and obviously, as you know, we've worked to get those level of standards in our product. So certainly key for the security restrictions and certifications. So can you give a little more insight of how these certifications help ensure the security and reliability of products used by federal agencies?
Yeah, I like what you said that. Security, that's really where the FIPS comes in, and reliability is more on the common criteria side.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's that, like I said, it's that basic baseline that the government needs to know, and they've got to have that. They can't go buy a product, and especially when you start talking emerging products or new products in the federal space, they've got to have some sort of baseline. They've got to have some sort of reliability that they know that what this does. And without it, many we call them contract shops, people who purchase things, the purchasing officers, many contract shops will write those into their requirements, and they will not purchase things that don't meet them because they can't just accept a company's self-attestation is what they call it.
Right.
Yeah, they won't accept that because that doesn't necessarily mean they're always going to get that, right? Anybody can sign something saying, oh yeah, we meet these standards. But without some external certification that's been verified, they don't know for sure if that's being done. Not saying that someone do it maliciously, but there could be a lot of mistakes if you don't have something that verifies it.
No, that's a great point. I mean, even my limited knowledge in the space, I learned you can actually just buy, disk drives that meet the criteria, but that doesn't necessarily mean the whole product meets the criteria.
And that's a really good point, that these certifications can apply to certain parts of a product or certain parts of a solution, but that doesn't mean it necessarily applies to all. And there's a lot of consternation among purchasing offers and contract shops where they try to drill in and ask a lot of details. It causes things to slow down sometimes when the government's buying. But it's what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to ask those questions and get drilling those details.
Right. You mentioned CISA earlier when you started talking about it. Can you provide some insight and overview behind CISA's M21-31 directive, specifically around packet capture requirements and the logging requirements there?
Yeah, so the origin of the M2131 OMB and CISA mandate actually comes from the SolarWinds breach. So in SolarWinds, what they found out is as they went to the different agencies and tried to help them deal with this breach, they were finding there was a varied level of logging and varied level of security tooling that allowed CISA to assist these agencies. And so they wanted a basic standard for logging and forensics that allowed CISA to come in and help these agencies. That's the origins of where M2131 came from, was just their experience of trying to broadly touch a lot of different agencies for that reactive to the breach with SolarWinds. So M2131 was created, and there's been quite a bit of conversation among vendors about whether or not everything in 2131 is necessary. It is obviously created by a DFIR guy. There's no doubt that the digital forensics and incident response people created it because they want everything.
Right.
It is a widespread requirement for logging and forensics data. Everything from EDR to what you just mentioned, PCAP. And PCAP is prominently pulled out and specifically called out in this M2131 because it is critical, and the forensics teams view it as critical. So it is individually pulled out and not just aggregate, because the logging in general is very inclusive when they talk about everything must be logged like this, and there's retention times. But when it comes to PCAP, it has its own line, and they very clearly state that it needs to be done, and it needs to be done for these types of flows, and it needs to be retained for 72 hours. So they're very clear that it is an important part of what the DFIR at CISA, the CISA DFIR team viewed as needed.
Yeah, so can you shed some details of why PCAP data is so critical for a DFIR expert, right, and threat intelligence across some of these agencies?
That's a great question. I view, and anybody really in cybersecurity probably does, I view PCAP as the closest you can get in fidelity to network forensics as you can probably to EDR. Like if you look at what EDR does on the endpoint, I think PCAP is the equivalent on the network. And there's a lot of people that have different network tools that they use for security, but the crown jewel is PCAP. That is where you can get to ground truth. You know that what you're looking at is what happened on the network, and so that's really where PCAP for a DFIR person is key and critical to understand what's happening. How do I know what really happened in this time frame? And then mapping that, a good DFI person will map that back to logging tools in their SIM and logging tools in their endpoint and put all three together to understand the full picture. Without that network forensics, you don't have that full picture of what happened.
Yeah, no, I've talked to a number of DFIR folks and say they'll use the words, it helps me connect the dots, right? You've got all these indicators and logs and various sources, but it pulls it all together.
Yep.
So let's kind of come back to the requirements of under M2131. How are you seeing it really enhance the cybersecurity posture of some of the agencies that are really starting to meet that criteria?
Sure. So one of the interesting things about federal agencies is that they struggle with buying technologies that are not required or audited against, because they can only spend so much money, right? There's a limited amount of resources for every organization, whether you're commercial or federal or whatever. And so when they look at there's an organization called GAO, and they come in and do audits on whether or not you meet certain mandates and requirements that you're supposed to hold. And so often, one of the cool things that's happened is often you'll see agencies want to buy certain things, but they can't find buckets and reasons that they can do that. But what's been pretty cool is that PCAP is one that most wanted anyway. They really do want that. And having this as a mandate has allowed them to go buy that, and also in many cases to do more than just the basics. So they'll say, hey, I need to collect PCAP and I need to have it for 72 hours. It needs to be ingress, egress. But a lot of agencies walk in and say, well, I'll put an extra 15, 20% on there to get these other things that may not be 100% required, but it gives me something I need. It gives me that forensics. It gives me that fidelity that I need. Or, hey, I only need to collect 72 hours, but I'm gonna put enough resources that maybe I'll collect a week. And that's going to help me as an agency when it comes to my security posture, because I need to be able to see further back than 72 hours. Boom might have happened further back than that. So we're seeing a lot of agencies take a little bit beyond the 72 hours because of that value of PCAP. And I think that's been the greatest boon from my perspective, is that it's justified agencies going out and getting things done that they needed to get done and wanted to get done, but didn't really have a budgeting line that they could align to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as you know, we've got some groups we're working with that are even pushing toward a month's worth of look back. So it's the effectiveness. Actually, that's my next question. Do you got any great examples you can share of how, obviously sensitivity of security nature here?
Yeah. So I know I'll give you two examples. One on the civilian side, one on the DoD side. There was a civilian agency that had gotten an alert, found something. They were sure it was an incident. They thought they had patient zero. They had been dealing with the EDR data and the SIM data, and they were initiating the DFIR. When the DFIR team took over, as they looked at the PCAP, they immediately found that was not patient zero. Everybody thought that was patient zero, but when they looked at the network logs and they see what happened, like, nope, that's not patient zero. Patient zero is over here in the same subnet, but it's not. That's not it. And that's the kind of thing that you've got to be able to find. That was a civilian agency. Right. One of the other ones is and these are basics. I can't really, give you some. It's hard in the government because you're not supposed to talk too much about things. But
yeah,
on the DoD side, PCAP, I can give you an example where they didn't know for sure what was going on. They were having a hard time determining if some traffic was anomalous or not. They thought it might have been a software, and this goes back to like a SolarWinds example. They thought it might have been potentially a software update, but they weren't sure. They were looking at this, and then they were able to pull the PCAP and compare and do some digging, and they did find that it was command and control. It was C2 that was happening on that endpoint, and it was masquerading very well as a software package. And so using the PCAP, they were able to drill into what was in there, and they found commands inside the PCAP. They're like, wait, that's not just software update. That's literally a command to do something. But they wouldn't have been able to do that if they hadn't been able to get in the guts of the traffic itself. Metadata is not going to tell you that. And depending on what you see in the endpoint in the SIM, you may not see that. But you look at that, if you're able to get into the actual packets and look what's inside of there, you can see, oh, no, there's an issued command hidden in that traffic.
Right. No, those are excellent. I'm going to use those examples in my future discussions. So, kind of coming back to the requirements, right? The agencies are trying to meet these requirements. What are some of the challenges you see them running into, and how are they addressing or trying to overcome those challenges?
The biggest challenge they have is there's been a lot more mandates and requirements, whether it's M2131. 2209, which was the EDR mandate. There's software development mandates. There's There are so many new mandates that have come out since we had all the breaches that really 2020, 2021 timeframe. We had a lot of problems in the federal government. And so we had a lot of drawdowns. The original Biden memo on cybersecurity in May of 21 produced several drawdowns, several new memos that fell out of that. And so it's been really hard for the government to prioritize and figure out how do we meet all these with the budget what we have. What I'm seeing is there's now been a coalescing, and people are starting to put the pieces together that zero trust, which is a marketing term, it is, but it is the idea behind security should be in the beginning, the conversation of how we design things, not a after the fact. That's really where zero trust comes into. How are we going to design an architecture that has security in mind from the moment? We talk about shift left when it comes to development. It's shift left when it comes to architectural design of infrastructure. Let's include security from the moment we start. That's how we're getting to solving the problems, because bolting it on the back end is too costly. If we start having the conversation earlier, and that's what zero trust is forcing, if we're having that conversation earlier of how do we design a system, an architecture, a network that has the security checks as we're developing and as we're implementing, rather than bolting it on after the fact or trying to detect it or sense it after the fact. That's what's allowing them to get closer and closer to meeting some of these mandates, because that now you're talking about infrastructure, sharing that burden of how do we do this well.
No, that's an excellent point. And I keep hearing the conversation around security levels of resiliency, right? Creating that levels from the architecture at the beginning,
right,
to be secure and resilient on that.
And the catchphrase is secure by design. Zero trust is a marketing term. Secure by design is a marketing term.
Right.
I don't have a problem with marketing terms if people start to understand that when you get past the fact that it's a marketing term, it actually has value. And in both cases, those two, which mean the same thing in a lot of ways, do have value.
Right. So beyond the directives and the mandates, overall cybersecurity ecosystem that are being put in place, are there still areas of risk that you don't think are being addressed?
Yes. It's hard for government agencies to prioritize and to figure out where to put things. And one of the challenges the government has, and I don't even know how to solve this problem, to be honest with you, is when you look at common criteria, you look at, or NIAP, and you look at things like FIPS, there's a ton of those kinds of requirements to do business in federal. Those become a barrier for new and emerging products, for new ways to solve problems. You guys went through that process to get those certifications so that you could do business with the federal government. But you guys weren't a brand new company that's just trying to survive.
Right.
That's a tough spot. When you see these new and emerging security approaches, many of them they can't do business in federal because they don't have those security. And honestly, they shouldn't do business in federal until they go through those things. But it's a chicken and the egg. It's a really tough spot for both the companies and for the government. No one wants to just exempt anyone, and they shouldn't. But at the same time, how do you help them get through that burden to be able to do business? It's a tough spot, and I think that's really honestly the biggest challenge that agencies face is how do they keep up with their commercial brethren who are adopting new technologies, and in some cases they pay the price for that. Let's be honest. You do bleeding edge, sometimes you bleed. The government doesn't tend to do bleeding edge very often. They could do leading edge, but not bleeding edge because of those barriers to entry. So I see that as a big challenge that I really don't have an answer to. I don't know how you do this better because I agree with the barriers and why they exist.
No, that's great insights on some of the missing the leading or bleeding edge things because of the requirements. It's a challenge, and like you said, it's a fine line. So, Jean-Paul, looking ahead, what emerging trends or technologies are you thinking agencies should be considered to stay ahead of the cyber threats and the threat actors while still trying to comply with these certifications and directives?
Yeah, so in my view, the current emerging trends that they really need to be focused on are those leading edge companies and products that are coming in, and how do we embrace them? How do we figure them out? when it comes to cloud security, data security, network security. There are several areas where the bad guys are ahead. Generative AI is a serious problem right now. I've helped some people understand why generative AI is something to be paying attention to in this way. When it comes to the government, they employ and deploy generative AI responsibly, as they should. They're adults. They should treat generative AI as something that you need to be, hey, we need to know what it's going to do and how it's going to do it before we deploy it. We don't want to break things or hurt things. The bad guys don't care. I kind of look at it as the government agencies and companies deploy as an adult would, with responsibility. Hackers tend to be more like 10-year-old boys. I mean, they're going to play around with things. They don't care if they break anything, right? They'll deploy generative AI in any way possible to see what happens. And if it breaks their computer, whatever. It doesn't bother them. That allows them to be ahead of the responsible adults in deploying and learning. Just like a 10-year-old boy can learn technology faster because he's not afraid to break anything. And the adult's like, whoa, I'm going to make sure before I hit that button, I'm going to break anything. Well, that slows down your adoption and it slows down your ability to keep up. And I see that as a major problem in what I call the generative AI arms race. The bad guys don't have any restrictions. They don't have any qualms about breaking things, including their own stuff, much less anybody else's. Whereas we need to be operating as responsible adults in how we do it. So that to me, that's a significant challenge. Again, going back to my last one, I don't have a good answer to.
Right. That's an excellent point. It's funny you said that. I was just reading an article this morning that they did a study on a generative AI that was playing a game, and the smarter the AI got on the game, the more it tended to cheat. I don't know. This was a study. Like I said, I don't know the details behind it.
Now the question is did the generative AI have the boundaries not to cheat, but chose to go beyond them, or did they take those boundaries off? I'd love to know that one. You have to send me that. That's interesting. I want to know more about that.
I'll see if I can find it again. There's something on a feed I saw, so I'll have to dig through that. Jean-Paul, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and joining us to share your insights in how to better secure networks. We ask our listeners to tune in next time for another edition of the Endace Packet Forensic Files. For more information about Endace's network packet capture platform and our integrations with our Fusion technology partners, please go to endace.com. JP, thank you. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.